Picture this. You're scrolling through LinkedIn, complaining about your micromanaging boss and that broken coffee machine in the break room. You think your job is hell. Well, let me introduce you to Jeffrey the Gong Farmer, whose Monday morning routine involved descending into a literal pit of human waste, with nothing but a shovel, and the faint hope he wouldn't suffocate before lunch. Or perhaps you'd prefer to meet Agnes the Sim Eater, whose career involved literally consuming the moral baggage of dead strangers at funeral feasts. Your worst workday suddenly doesn't seem so bad, does it? Welcome to medieval job hunting, where competitive salary meant you probably won't die in the first week, and workplace safety was more of a gentle suggestion than an actual policy. Let's set the scene, shall we? The year is 3047, and you're standing in the town square of some godforsaken medieval settlement. The Black Death is making its rounds, like an overly enthusiastic door-to-door salesman. Rats are literally everywhere, not as pets, mind you. And the closest thing to a bathroom is a hole in the ground that 7 families share. This is peak medieval living, folks. Now, imagine opening up Indeed in this charming time period. Forget remote work or flexible hours. The job listings read more like horror movie casting calls. Wanted, person comfortable working with bodily fluids, rotting flesh, and the occasional demon possession. Previous experience with torture devices a plus. Dental plan not included because, well, nobody has teeth anyway. But here's the thing about medieval society that our history books conveniently gloss over. Every single disgusting, dangerous, soul-crushing job you're about to hear about was absolutely essential. These weren't fringe occupations for society's outcasts. These were the people who kept civilization from completely collapsing into chaos. They were the unsung heroes of the Dark Ages, though calling them heroes might be a bit generous considering some of the things they did. Think about it this way. Modern society runs on a complex network of systems we barely notice. Your garbage gets picked up, your sewage gets processed, your food gets inspected. In medieval times, these jobs existed too, but with about as much regulation as a medieval free-for-all, and roughly the same safety standards as a toddler playing with scissors. The Gong Farmer wasn't just some unfortunate soul who drew the short straw. He was a crucial member of society who prevented entire cities from drowning in their own waste. The executioner wasn't just a government-sanctioned murderer. He was maintaining law and order in a world where the alternative was vigilante justice and mob rule. The Sin Eater wasn't performing some quaint folk ritual. She was providing genuine psychological comfort to grieving families who believed their loved one's eternal soul hung in the balance. But let's be honest, knowing these jobs were important doesn't make them any less horrifying. In fact, it makes them worse, because it means these people had no choice. This was their career path, their family trade, their ticket to not starving to death in a ditch somewhere. Imagine explaining your job at a dinner party. Oh me, I extract confessions through creative application of medieval torture devices. Pass the wine, would you? The medieval job market was essentially a nightmare economy, where the most essential services were also the most traumatizing. It was like if LinkedIn existed, but every job posting ended with high probability of psychological scarring, or frequent exposure to plague-ridden corpses. Career advancement meant getting really good at something no modern person would do for any amount of money. And here's where it gets darkly fascinating. These weren't temporary gigs people did while waiting for something better. These were generational trades passed down from father to son, mother to daughter. Little Timmy didn't grow up dreaming of becoming a knight. He grew up knowing he'd inherit dad's cesspit cleaning business, and maybe if he was lucky, expand into organic waste management. The social hierarchy was brutally clear. At the top, you had your lords and ladies, living in castles and complaining about the wine selection. At the bottom, you had people whose job descriptions would violate about 17 modern labor laws before you even got to the actual work requirements. And somewhere in between, you had everyone else, desperately trying not to slide down into the truly nightmarish occupations. What's particularly unsettling is how normalized it all was. Nobody was writing angry letters to the editor about working conditions in the torture chamber. There was no medieval OSHA investigating workplace safety violations in the executioner's quarters. This was just life. And people adapted to it with the kind of grim acceptance that would make modern HR departments weep. So as we dive deeper into these careers that would make your worst job seem like a luxury resort experience, remember this. Every single one of these positions was filled by real people with real families, real hopes, and real dreams that probably didn't include spending their days elbow deep in medieval horrors. The question isn't whether you could survive these jobs. It's whether you'd retain enough of your sanity to remember why you started working in the first place. Meet the gong farmer, whose job title sounds quaint and agricultural, until you realize gong was medieval slang for the communal toilets, and farming involved harvesting something no modern person would touch without a hazmat suit. These brave souls were the sanitation engineers of their time. Except their engineering involved crawling into underground chambers filled with centuries of human waste. Picture your morning routine. Alarm clock, coffee, maybe check your phone. Now picture Jeffrey's morning routine. Strap on leather boots that have absorbed more sewage than a municipal treatment plant. Grab a shovel that doubles as both tool and weapon against rats the size of small dogs, and descend into what can only be described as humanity's digestive aftermath made manifest. The technical aspects of gong farming were surprisingly sophisticated, in the same way that a medieval catapult is sophisticated, crude, but effective. These weren't random holes in the ground. They were carefully constructed waste management systems called garderobes, built into castle walls or positioned over rivers. The gong farmer's job was to clean them out when they became too full, which happened with the frequency of a particularly reliable natural disaster. But here's where it gets really medieval level awful. They could only work at night, not because of privacy concerns or noise ordinances, but because the job was so revolting that authorities banned daytime gong farming to prevent public health riots. Imagine being so disgusting at your job that the government literally makes it illegal for people to witness you working. The work itself involved descending into chambers that hadn't been cleaned in months or sometimes years, armed with nothing but primitive tools and the kind of determination that can only come from extreme poverty. They'd scrape, shovel and haul out waste wooden buckets, often working by candlelight in spaces barely large enough for a person to move around in. The smell alone was reportedly enough to knock a horse unconscious. And that's not medieval hyperbole, that's documented medical observation. What's particularly grim is that gong farming was actually a regulated profession with its own guild. Yes, there was literally a professional association for people who scooped human waste for a living. They had apprenticeships, territorial disputes, and probably annual conferences where they discussed the latest innovations in cesspit technology. Johnson's been experimenting with a new shovel design that really improves extraction efficiency in the deeper chambers. The health hazards were exactly what you'd expect, and then some. Methane poisoning was common. These chambers were basically giant fermentation vats producing toxic gases that could kill you faster than you could say workplace safety violation. Many gong farmers died on the job, not from dramatic accidents but from simply breathing while working. Their families would find them collapsed in the waste chambers, victims of their own profession's atmospheric conditions. But wait, it gets worse. The waste they extracted wasn't just thrown away, it was valuable fertilizer called night soil. Gong farmers were essentially harvesting medieval gold, if gold were brown, toxic and capable of transmitting every disease known to humanity. They'd sell this night soil to farmers, creating a circular economy that's both ingenious and absolutely horrifying. The social stigma was crushing. Gong farmers were required to live outside town walls, and could only enter during their working hours. They couldn't frequent the same taverns, attend the same churches, or interact with respectable society except in strictly professional capacities. They were essential but untouchable, like medieval nuclear waste technicians. Some gong farmers tried to improve their working conditions through innovation. They developed primitive breathing apparatus, essentially cloth masks soaked in herbs, and created specialized tools for different types of waste extraction. These weren't safety regulations handed down from authorities. These were survival adaptations developed by people who'd rather not die while doing the job nobody else would touch. The psychological toll was probably the worst part. Modern sewage workers have protective equipment, safety protocols, and the knowledge that they're preventing disease outbreaks. Medieval gong farmers had none of that, just the certain knowledge that their job was literally dealing with society's shit day after day, until they either died from the work or died from something else first. Yet these people persisted, generation after generation, because somebody had to do it. Without gong farmers, medieval cities would have drowned in their own waste within months. They were the thin, smelly line between civilization and complete sanitary collapse. They prevented plague outbreaks, maintained basic hygiene, and kept human settlements from becoming uninhabitable cesspits. The irony is beautiful in its darkness. The people doing the most essential job for public health were also the most ostracized by that same public. They saved lives daily, but were treated like walking disease vectors. They prevented epidemics, but weren't allowed to live where decent people lived. So the next time you're having a rough day at work, remember Geoffrey the Gong Farmer, crawling through medieval sewage in the dead of night, keeping civilization running one awful shovelful at a time. And he still showed up on Monday mornings. Now let's talk about the executioner, whose job combined the worst aspects of public speaking, manual labor, and customer service. Except his customers were having the worst possible day, and his performance reviews were conducted by crowds of bloodthirsty spectators who'd literally throw rotten vegetables if his technique wasn't up to snuff. This wasn't some hooded figure lurking in castle dungeons like Hollywood suggests. Medieval executioners were legitimate government employees with benefits, pension plans, and the kind of job security that came from being literally irreplaceable. After all, how do you write a resignation letter when your replacement needs months of training to properly separate heads from shoulders? The technical skills required were surprisingly extensive. A good executioner needed to be part surgeon, part engineer, and part showman. One clean stroke with an axe sounds simple until you consider that axes are heavy, necks have bones, and you've got several hundred people watching who will absolutely riot if you botch the job and have to take multiple swings like some amateur weekend warrior chopping firewood. But here's where medieval employment law gets really interesting. Executioners weren't just killers for hire. They were comprehensive criminal justice administrators. They handled torture sessions for extracting confessions, managed the dungeon facilities, maintained all the execution equipment, and often served as the town's official torturer. It was like being a one-person Department of Corrections, except with more screaming and significantly less paperwork. The job came with some genuinely bizarre perks and restrictions. Executioners were often paid quite well, sometimes more than skilled craftsmen, because nobody wanted to do it, and you really didn't want your executioner to be motivated by financial desperation. They also received unique legal protections. Killing people was their job, so they couldn't be prosecuted for murder while working. However, they were also legally required to live outside the town walls and were forbidden from entering certain establishments or interacting with respectable society. The social isolation was brutal. Imagine trying to make small talk at a medieval mixer. So, what do you do for work? Oh, I specialize in separating people's heads from their bodies using various sharp instruments. Would you like to dance? Executioners often married within their profession, or remained bachelors, because dating was complicated when your job involved killing people for money, even if it was perfectly legal. The equipment maintenance alone was a full-time job. Axes needed constant sharpening. A dull blade meant a messy execution, and messy executions meant angry crowds who might decide the executioner himself deserved the same fate. Gallows required regular inspection and repair, torture devices needed calibration and cleaning, and everything had to be kept in perfect working order, because your next customer might be the local lord's son, and you absolutely could not afford to screw that up. Public executions were essentially medieval performance art, and the executioner was the star of the show. The crowd expected drama, spectacle, and most importantly, competence. A skilled executioner could make the job look effortless. One swift, clean stroke that separated head from body so smoothly it was almost artistic. A bad executioner would hack and chop like he was trying to split a particularly stubborn log, traumatizing the audience, and probably getting himself fired, possibly permanently. But perhaps the most psychologically demanding aspect was the confession extraction. Medieval justice relied heavily on confessions, and getting them required what we'd now recognize as enhanced interrogation techniques. The executioner wasn't just applying torture, he was conducting careful psychological operations designed to break down resistance while keeping the subject alive and coherent enough to provide usable testimony. Some executioners became genuinely famous for their skill. There are historical records of executioners who were requested specifically by condemned nobles who wanted to ensure a quick, clean death. Imagine having such a reputation for professional excellence that people specifically asked for you to kill them. I'm scheduled for execution next Tuesday. Could you check if Master Heinrich is available? I've heard he's got the smoothest technique in the region. The career progression was limited but interesting. Senior executioners might train apprentices, though the training process was presumably awkward for everyone involved. Now watch carefully as I demonstrate proper axe grip. You'll want to follow through on your swing, like this. Any questions before we move on to advanced torture techniques? The psychological toll was managed through professionalization and social separation. By treating it as a skilled trade with technical requirements and professional standards, executioners could maintain some emotional distance from the work. They weren't murderers, they were craftsmen whose medium happened to be human termination. What's particularly fascinating is how executioners dealt with repeat customers, people who survived their executions due to technical failures or last-minute pardons. There are recorded cases of people being scheduled for execution multiple times, creating an awkward professional relationship between executioner and victim. "Good morning, William. Back again, I see. Shall we get started?" The job security was excellent until it wasn't. Successful executioners could work for decades, building reputations and steady clientele. But political changes, religious reforms, or simply aging out of the physical demands could end careers abruptly, and finding new employment after listing professional executioner on your resume was challenging, to put it mildly. These weren't monsters or sadists, they were skilled professionals doing society's dirty work with the kind of competence that kept medieval justice systems functioning. They maintained law and order through the ultimate deterrent while managing the complex social and technical challenges of their impossible profession. Someone had to swing the axe. They just made sure to swing it well. Enter the sin eater, whose job description reads like something from a fever dream. Professional consumer of dead people's moral baggage. These fascinating individuals operated on the principle that sins were transferable commodities that could be literally consumed, making them essentially spiritual janitors for the medieval afterlife industry. The concept sounds insane until you understand the medieval mindset about sin and salvation. People genuinely believed that unconfessed sins would damn their souls to eternal torment, and death had this inconvenient habit of arriving before people finished their spiritual housekeeping. Enter the sin eater, who could absorb those leftover sins through a ritualistic meal, essentially providing posthumous moral laundering services. Picture the scene. A family gathers around their recently deceased patriarch, genuinely terrified that Uncle Harold's gambling debts and that incident with the neighbor's wife might have doomed his soul. Then Agnes the Sin Eater arrives, looking like someone who spent years absorbing other people's moral failures, because that's exactly what she's done. She places bread and ale on the corpse's chest, eats and drinks while reciting specific incantations, and voila, Uncle Harold's sins are now her problem. But here's where this job gets psychologically horrifying. Sin eaters genuinely believed they were absorbing actual sins. This wasn't performance art or cynical fraud. These people thought they were literally taking on the moral corruption of every person whose sins they consumed. Imagine going to work every day knowing that your job involves making your soul progressively more damned with each client. The social consequences were devastating. Sin eaters occupied the absolute bottom of medieval society's hierarchy, below even gong farmers and executioners. At least those professions dealt with physical filth and death. Sin eaters dealt with spiritual contamination, which medieval people considered infinitely worse. They were treated like walking repositories of evil, too dangerous to interact with but too useful to eliminate entirely. The ritual itself was carefully choreographed. The bread symbolically absorbed the deceased's sins, the ale washed them down, and specific prayers transferred the moral burden to the sin eater. Different regions had variations. Some used cake instead of bread. Some included salt for purification. Others required the sin eater to eat while standing on the corpse, but the core concept remained constant. Sins were tangible things that could be moved from one person to another through ritualistic consumption. What's particularly tragic is how people became sin eaters in the first place. This wasn't a career anyone chose voluntarily. Most were desperate widows, social outcasts, or people who'd already been marginalized by society and had literally no other options for survival. They were trading their eternal souls for enough money to buy food, which is probably the most medieval transaction imaginable. The psychological preparation required was extensive. Sin eaters needed to reconcile themselves to the belief that they were willingly damning their souls to help others achieve salvation. Some developed elaborate theological justifications, perhaps God would forgive them for their sacrifice, or maybe accumulated sins could be balanced out through good deeds. Others simply accepted damnation as the price of survival in a world that offered them no alternatives. The business side was surprisingly complex. Wealthy families paid more for experienced sin-eaters who could handle more serious sins. There were different rates for different types of moral transgressions. Adultery cost more than petty theft. Murder required premium pricing. Some sin-eaters specialized in particular categories of sin, developing reputations as experts in absorbing specific types of moral corruption. But the most disturbing aspect was the cumulative effect. Each ceremony added another layer of absorbed sin, and sin-eaters carried the psychological weight of every moral failure they'd consumed. They became walking repositories of their community's collective guilt, bearing spiritual burdens that would have crushed most people's sanity. Many sin-eaters died young, not from physical causes, but from what we'd now recognize as severe psychological trauma. The isolation was complete and permanent. Sin-eaters couldn't attend church. Their presence would contaminate sacred ground. They couldn't participate in community activities, maintain normal relationships, or live normal lives in any meaningful sense. They existed in spiritual quarantine, too morally toxic for human society but too necessary to abandon entirely. Some sin-eaters tried to manage their psychological burden through various coping mechanisms. They'd perform their own purification rituals, maintain elaborate spiritual practices, or develop philosophical frameworks that made their situation bearable. Others simply descended into madness, becoming the hollow-eyed figures of local legend who wandered the countryside absorbing sins until they died. The irony is breathtaking. The people providing the ultimate spiritual service, ensuring others' salvation, were guaranteed their own damnation. They were sacrificing their eternal souls so others could achieve paradise, making them simultaneously the most selfless and most cursed members of their society. What makes this particularly haunting is that some sin-eaters genuinely found meaning in their work. They saw themselves as spiritual martyrs, trading their own salvation to ensure others could reach heaven. There's something almost beautiful about that level of self-sacrifice, even if it was based on beliefs we now consider superstitious. The profession eventually died out as religious practices evolved, and the Catholic Church cracked down on folk rituals that weren't officially sanctioned. But for several centuries, sin-eaters provided a crucial service for communities that genuinely need new souls could be saved, through ritualistic consumption of moral corruption. They ate sin so others could taste salvation. And they did it knowing exactly what it cost them. Let that sink in for a moment. Welcome to medieval pest control, where the exterminator was less concerned with customer satisfaction and more focused on preventing the literal apocalypse. Meet the rat catcher, whose job involved battling an enemy that outnumbered humans roughly 10,000 to 1, and carried enough diseases to wipe out entire civilizations. This wasn't about keeping your kitchen clean. This was biological warfare conducted by someone armed with a stick and unlimited overtime. Medieval rats weren't the cute lab animals or pet store companions we know today. These were battle-hardened survivors, the size of small cats, organized into what can only be described as rodent crime syndicates that controlled entire city districts. They moved in coordinated packs, had established territorial boundaries, and showed the kind of tactical intelligence that would make modern military strategists weep with envy. The rat catcher was essentially a one-person army, fighting an endless war against an enemy that reproduced faster than he could kill them, carried weapons-grade pathogens, and had home field advantage in every sewer, cellar, and grain storage facility in the known world. Imagine trying to manage a pest problem, where the pests are smart enough to learn from your tactics, numerous enough to overwhelm any strategy, and capable of killing you with their breath. The tools of the trade were surprisingly sophisticated, considering they were designed to combat creatures that weighed less than a medieval chicken. Rat catchers carried an arsenal that included various trap designs, trained ferrets for tunnel warfare, clubs specifically designed for rodent combat, and an assortment of poisons that were about as dangerous to the user as they were to the target species. But here's where medieval pest control gets really interesting. Rat catchers weren't just exterminators, they were plague prevention specialists. The Black Death was spread by fleas, carried by rats, making rat population control literally a matter of life and death for entire communities. A good rat catcher wasn't just keeping grain stores clean. He was preventing the collapse of civilization one dead rodent at a time. The business model was fascinating in its simplicity. Rat catchers were usually paid per rat killed, creating an incentive system that encouraged maximum carnage. They'd collect rat tails as proof of their work, leading to medieval accounting practices that would make modern auditors question their career choices. Let's see, 17 rat tails from the miller's shop, 23 from the baker's basement, and 41 from that nightmare hellscape underneath the cathedral. The work environment was exactly as pleasant as you'd expect. Rat catchers spent their days crawling through sewers, cellars, and other underground spaces where rats congregated, armed with primitive weapons and protected by nothing more than leather clothing and optimistic thinking. They worked in cramped, disease-infested conditions, where every surface was contaminated with rat urine, feces, and the decomposing remains of previous battles. What made the job particularly challenging was rat intelligence. Medieval rats learned to avoid traps, recognize poison baits, and adapt their behavior based on previous encounters with rat catchers. This created an ongoing arms race where rat catchers had to constantly develop new strategies to stay ahead of their quarry. It was like playing chess against opponents who reproduced daily and had photographic memory. The health hazards were numerous and creative. Beyond the obvious diseases carried by rats, plague, typhus, rabies, rat catchers faced unique occupational risks. Rat bites could become infected with exotic pathogens, rat urine could cause kidney damage, and prolonged exposure to rat habitats led to respiratory problems that shortened lifespans considerably. They were basically working in biological weapons testing facilities without protective equipment. Some rat catchers specialized in particular environments or techniques. Urban specialists focused on city sewers and building infestations, while rural experts dealt with grain storage and farm buildings. Technical specialists might focus on trap design and poison development, while combat specialists excelled at direct confrontation using clubs and trained animals. It was pest control with professional specialization. The psychological challenges were underestimated by everyone except the rat catchers themselves. Spending your working life in underground spaces fighting intelligent enemies that could kill you with their presence takes a mental toll that medieval society didn't really understand. Many rat catchers developed what we'd now recognize as occupational anxiety, paranoia about disease transmission, and social isolation due to their association with plague vectors. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect was the futility factor. No matter how many rats a rat catcher killed, there were always more. They were fighting a war that couldn't be won, only managed, against an enemy that had every advantage except individual size. It was like being hired to empty the ocean with a bucket, except the ocean was actively trying to kill you and everyone you'd ever met. The social status was complex. Rat catchers were essential but untouchable, necessary but avoided, respected but feared. People needed their services desperately, but didn't want to associate with someone who spent their days in close contact with plague carriers. They existed in a professional limbo, where everyone wanted their services, but nobody wanted to invite them to dinner. Some rat catchers achieved legendary status through exceptional skill or innovative techniques. Historical records mention rat catchers who could clear entire buildings in a single day, or who developed trap designs that became industry standards. They were the special forces of medieval pest control, earning reputations that spread across regions and attracted clients from multiple cities. The equipment maintenance was surprisingly complex. Traps needed constant repair and adjustment. Ferrets required feeding and training, weapons needed sharpening, and poisons had to be prepared fresh to maintain effectiveness. Rat catchers were essentially running mobile laboratories dedicated to developing new methods of rodent destruction. These weren't just exterminators. They were the thin line between medieval civilization and complete ecological collapse by rodent invasion. They prevented famines by protecting grain stores, stopped plagues by controlling disease vectors, and maintained basic sanitation in a world where rats literally outnumbered humans. They fought the endless war so everyone else could sleep safely. The barber surgeon. Medieval society's answer to the question, what if we combined personal grooming with major surgery and threw in some light dentistry for variety? These multi-talented professionals offered a full range of services: haircuts, shaves, tooth extractions, amputations, bloodletting, and the occasional exorcism if business was slow. It was like visiting a one-stop shop for everything involving sharp objects and bodily fluids. The professional requirements were refreshingly simple: own some knives, have steady hands, and possess the kind of optimistic confidence that comes from having absolutely no medical training whatsoever. Formal education was optional, sterilization was a foreign concept, and anesthesia was whatever alcohol happened to be able. They were basically performing surgery using the same tools they used for grooming, which explains why medieval mortality rates were what modern insurance companies would call suboptimal. The iconic barber pole, those red, white, and blue spirals we still see today, originated from barber surgeon advertising. Red represented blood, white symbolized bandages, and blue indicated veins. It was essentially a medieval billboard advertising quality bloodletting and light surgery while you wait. Imagine driving past that sign today, Bob's barbershop, haircuts, hot shaves and emergency amputations, no appointment necessary. The bloodletting business was particularly lucrative because medieval medicine was convinced that most diseases were caused by having too much blood. Feeling sick? You probably had excess blood. Depressed? Definitely too much blood. Broken leg? Well, that's obviously a blood-related issue. Barber surgeons would slice open veins and let patients bleed into bowls until they either felt better or passed out, whichever came first. But the real moneymaker was dentistry, which in medieval times was less about oral hygiene and more about strategic tooth removal using blacksmith tools. There was no such thing as a gentle dental cleaning. If your tooth hurt, it was coming out, probably along with several of its neighbors for good measure. Barber surgeons approached dental problems with the same subtlety they used for everything else. Grab the biggest pliers available and pull until something gives way. The surgical procedures were exactly as sophisticated as you'd expect from someone whose medical training consisted of, I watched the previous barber surgeon do it once. They performed everything from cataract removal to brain surgery using instruments that had probably been used for food preparation earlier that morning. Sterilization involved wiping tools on whatever cloth was handy, and surgical precision was more of an aspiration than an actual technique. What made this job particularly challenging was the customer service aspect. Unlike modern medical professionals, barber surgeons had to maintain cheerful conversation while performing procedures that would traumatize modern emergency room doctors. How's the family, John? Hold still while I saw through this bone. Did you hear about the miller's daughter getting married? Almost through the joint now. Lovely weather we're having for an amputation, don't you think? The business model was based on volume rather than specialization. A successful barber surgeon might see a dozen customers per day, providing services ranging from beard trims to emergency surgery. They were the medieval equivalent of urgent care centers, except with significantly more screaming and substantially lower survival rates. Their shops were part salon, part hospital, part morgue, depending on how the day was going. The tools were multi-purpose in ways that would horrify modern medical professionals. The same razor used for shaving beards was used for surgical incisions. Tooth extraction pliers doubled as bone-setting tools. Scissors cut both hair and sutures, assuming anyone survived long enough to need sutures. It was medical equipment sharing, taken to its logical and terrifying conclusion. But perhaps the most impressive aspect was their confidence in treating conditions they couldn't possibly understand. Medieval barber surgeons would cheerfully attempt to treat everything from simple headaches to complex internal injuries using the same basic approach. Cut something open, remove whatever looked suspicious, and hope for the best. They were performing experimental surgery on a daily basis, using patients as unwitting research subjects in the grand medieval experiment of let's see what happens if we do this. The training process was refreshingly straightforward. Apprentice with an experienced barber surgeon until you felt confident enough to hack at people on your own. There were no medical schools, licensing boards or competency exams, just on-the-job training that involved gradually working up from haircuts to major surgery. Today we're going to learn about trepanation, which involves drilling holes in people's skulls. Watch carefully, because you'll be doing this yourself next week. The mortality rates were impressive in the worst possible way. But barber surgeons maintained their reputations through selective memory and creative record-keeping. Successful procedures were remembered and discussed extensively, while unsuccessful ones were attributed to the patient's moral failings or astrological conditions. Poor William didn't survive the leg amputation, but that's because Mars was in retrograde. My surgical technique was flawless. What's particularly fascinating is how barber surgeons dealt with their own medical needs. They couldn't very well treat themselves, but they also couldn't seek treatment from competitors without admitting professional inadequacy. This created a medieval medical catch-22 where the people most qualified to perform surgery were also the least likely to receive competent medical care when they needed it. The social status was respectable but precarious. Successful barber surgeons could earn decent livings and community respect, but one high-profile surgical disaster could destroy a reputation overnight. They walked a fine line between being seen as skilled professionals and dangerous charlatans, depending largely on their recent success rate and local mortality statistics. These weren't monsters or incompetents. They were skilled craftsmen working with primitive tools and non-existent medical knowledge, doing their best to help people in an era when first do no harm hadn't been invented yet. They combined multiple trades into one profession, because medieval society needed barbers, surgeons, and dentists, but could only afford to pay one person. They cut hair, saved lives, and occasionally did both simultaneously. Meet the food taster, whose job description was refreshingly simple. Eat the king's food before he does, and try not to die. It was quality control with the ultimate performance metric. If you keeled over during dessert, you'd failed both professionally and personally. This wasn't about ensuring proper seasoning or temperature. This was about making sure dinner wasn't a cleverly disguised assassination attempt, served with a nice wine pairing. The position required a unique combination of culinary appreciation and fatalistic acceptance of mortality. Good tasters needed sophisticated palates capable of detecting subtle flavors that might indicate poison, combined with the psychological fortitude to consume potentially lethal substances multiple times daily. It was like being a sommelier for death, except with significantly worse job security and no opportunity for career advancement if you got it wrong. The technical skills were more complex than you might expect. Experienced tasters could identify dozens of different poisons by taste, texture, or smell. They knew which wines might mask arsenic, how mercury affected food color, and which seasonings could disguise the bitter taste of various plant toxins. They were essentially walking encyclopedias of medieval murder methods, except their research methodology involved personal consumption of the evidence. But here's where the job gets psychologically fascinating. Tasters had to maintain their effectiveness while knowing that every meal might be their last. They couldn't become paranoid or overly cautious, because that would interfere with their ability to properly evaluate food. They needed to approach each dish with professional detachment while simultaneously accepting that their next bite might trigger convulsions, paralysis, or a lingering death that would make their family wish they'd chosen a different career path. The social dynamics were incredibly complex. Tasters occupied a unique position in medieval court hierarchy. They were essential for the ruler's survival, but also constant reminders of assassination threats. They were simultaneously trusted allies and harbingers of doom, sitting at royal tables while embodying everyone's fears about violent death. Imagine trying to maintain dinner conversation while someone whose job involves dying before you eats everything first. The training process was presumably the most stressful apprenticeship in medieval history. New tasters had to learn poison identification through hands-on experience, which created a natural selection process that was brutal even by medieval standards. Those who survived their training period had demonstrated both competence and extraordinary luck, making them valuable but traumatized professionals who'd literally risk their lives to learn their trade. The equipment was surprisingly sophisticated for what amounts to professional eating. Tasters used specialized utensils that might reveal certain poisons through discoloration, maintained collections of antidotes for quick consumption after suspicious bites, and often carried various detection devices like narwhal horn, believed to neutralize poison, or bezoar stones, thought to absorb toxins from the digestive system. They were essentially mobile poison detection laboratories disguised as dinner guests. What made this job particularly nerve-wracking was the timing requirements. Tasters couldn't just sample food and wait hours to see if they died. Meals had to be served while still hot, and rulers weren't known for their patience when hungry. This created intense pressure to make life-or-death decisions about food safety within minutes of consumption, while maintaining the composure necessary to not alarm the entire royal court. The physical toll was cumulative and horrifying. Even non-lethal poisons could cause chronic health problems, and repeated exposure to sub-fatal doses of various toxins probably shortened lifespans considerably. Tasters were essentially conducting long-term medical experiments on themselves, using their own bodies as testing grounds for every creative poisoning attempt directed at their employers. The psychological challenges were equally severe. Tasters lived in constant awareness of their mortality, while maintaining the mental clarity necessary to detect potential threats. They had to balance professional paranoia with social functionality, remaining alert to assassination attempts while participating normally in court life. It was like being a food critic whose reviews were literally matters of life and death. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect was the success metrics. A taster's effectiveness was measured by their ability to die before their employer, making professional success synonymous with personal destruction. They were hired specifically to absorb assassination attempts, turning their own bodies into human shields against culinary murder. Their greatest professional achievement would be their final act of service. Some tasters developed elaborate personal protection protocols. They might consume small amounts of various antidotes before meals, maintain strict dietary regimens to improve poison resistance, or develop relationships with court physicians who could provide rapid treatment for suspected poisoning. They were essentially trying to optimize their survival chances while accepting that their job fundamentally involved voluntary poisoning. The career longevity was predictably limited. Successful tasters who survived multiple years on the job became legendary figures, their reputations based on the number of poisoning attempts they'd successfully detected or absorbed. They were living testimonials to both professional competence and extraordinary fortune, making them valuable but constantly endangered employees. What's particularly tragic is how tasters dealt with the knowledge that their deaths would be professional successes. They had to reconcile themselves to the idea that their martyrdom would be celebrated as evidence of job performance, while their survival would be measured by their continued usefulness as potential murder victims. They existed in a professional limbo where their value was directly proportional to their willingness to die. The social isolation was inevitable. Forming close relationships was complicated when your profession involved regularly risking death, and romantic partnerships were challenging when your job required you to potentially die during dinner. Tasters often remained unmarried or formed relationships within the dangerous profession's community, where the constant proximity to death was better understood. These weren't just employees, they were human insurance policies against assassination, walking guarantees of food safety, who paid for their employers' security with their own lives. They provided peace of mind for rulers who lived in constant fear of poisoning, transforming the act of eating from potential suicide into shared risk. They tasted death so others could dine in safety. Enter the leech collector, whose job involved wading through medieval swamps to harvest blood-sucking parasites for the medical profession. This was pharmaceutical procurement before modern supply chains, requiring someone to venture into disease-infested wetlands, armed with nothing but determination and an unhealthy willingness to let dozens of parasites attach to their bare legs for the sake of medical science. The technical requirements were surprisingly specific. Quality leeches for medical use had to be the right species, proper size, and adequately hungry to perform effective bloodletting. Leech collectors needed to distinguish between medicinal leeches and their less useful cousins, identify healthy specimens versus diseased ones, and maintain living inventory that required constant care and feeding. They were essentially running aquatic farms specializing in parasitic livestock. The harvesting process was exactly as horrifying as it sounds. Collectors would wade into swamp water wearing minimal clothing, allowing leeches to attach to their legs and arms naturally. Once a sufficient number had latched on, they'd carefully remove each leech and store it in containers designed to keep them alive during transport. It was like being a human bait trap for medical supplies, except the bait was your own blood, and the trap was your entire body. But here's where medieval medicine gets fascinatingly backwards. Leeches were considered high-quality medical equipment, making leech collectors essential suppliers for the healthcare industry. Physicians paid premium prices for fresh, active leeches, creating a lucrative market for people willing to serve as mobile blood banks for parasitic inventory. They were literally selling their blood by proxy, using leeches as intermediary collection agents. The occupational hazards extended far beyond the obvious blood loss. Swamps were breeding grounds for diseases that would make modern epidemiologists weep, and spending your working life wading through stagnant water while covered in open wounds was essentially volunteering for every waterborne pathogen in medieval Europe. Leech collectors faced risks from infected water, diseased parasites, and the various other creatures that called swamps home. The seasonal nature of the work created feast or famine economics. Leech activity was weather dependent, meaning collectors might work intensively during optimal conditions, while facing unemployment during winter months or dry periods. They had to harvest enough during productive seasons to survive lean times, creating pressure to maximize blood loss during peak leech availability windows. What made this profession particularly challenging was maintaining leech quality during storage and transport. These weren't preserved specimens. They were living medical devices that required proper care to maintain their effectiveness. Collectors needed to provide appropriate containers, proper feeding schedules, and optimal environmental conditions to keep their inventory alive and functional. They were running mobile intensive care units for blood-sucking parasites. The client relationships were professionally awkward in unique ways. Leech collectors had to interact with physicians and barber surgeons while covered in leech bites and smelling like swamp water, maintaining professional demeanor despite looking like they'd been attacked by aquatic vampires. They were representing the pharmaceutical supply chain while personally embodying its more disturbing aspects. Some collectors specialized in particular leech varieties, or developed expertise in leech husbandry that improved survival rates during storage. They might breed leeches in controlled environments, develop specialized feeding techniques, or create transport systems that maximized inventory health. These innovations could significantly improve profit margins and client satisfaction in the competitive leech market. The business model required careful inventory management. Leeches had limited shelf lives, specific storage requirements, and seasonal availability that affected pricing. Successful collectors had to balance supply costs, their own blood and health risks, against market demand, while maintaining quality standards that kept physicians satisfied with their products. They were essentially running biological supply chains with living inventory. The physical toll was cumulative and severe. Repeated blood loss from leech attachment weakened collectors over time, while constant exposure to swamp environments created chronic health problems that shortened working careers. Many collectors developed anemia, recurring infections, or other complications that forced early retirement from a profession that was already physically demanding. But perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect was the intimate relationship between collector and product. Unlike other medieval professions that dealt with external materials, leech collectors were literally feeding their inventory with their own bodies. They had personal, biological relationships with their merchandise that made the work uniquely invasive and psychologically complicated. The social stigma was predictable, but harsh. Leech collectors were associated with swamps, parasites, and medical procedures that most people found revolting. They were necessary but avoided, essential but untouchable, creating social isolation that was compounded by their professional association with blood-sucking creatures and disease-ridden environments. What's particularly impressive is how collectors managed the logistics of transporting live, active leeches to distant markets. They developed specialized containers, feeding protocols, and preservation techniques that kept inventory viable during extended travel periods. They were essentially running mobile biological laboratories specializing in parasite maintenance and transport. The market dynamics were influenced by medical fashion and seasonal demand. Bloodletting trends affected leech prices, epidemic outbreaks created surges in demand, and competition from other collectors influenced territorial arrangements in prime leech habitats. It was agricultural economics applied to parasitic livestock harvesting. Some collectors achieved regional recognition for consistently high-quality leeches or reliable supply relationships with major medical practitioners. They built reputations based on leech performance standards, inventory reliability, and professional service that established long-term business relationships in the medieval healthcare industry. The career progression was limited, but possible. Experienced collectors might transition into leech breeding, specialized medical supply, or training new collectors in harvesting techniques. Some developed expertise in related areas like medicinal herb collection or other medical supply procurement, diversifying their services within the healthcare support industry. These weren't just swamp workers, they were essential links in medieval medical supply chains, providing living medical devices that physicians relied on for treating everything from headaches to heart conditions. They waded through disease-infested waters to harvest parasites that kept the medieval healthcare system functioning. They bled so medicine could heal. The night soil man occupied a unique niche in medieval waste management, distinct from but related to the gong farmer we met earlier. While gong farmers cleaned out fixed facilities, night soil men were the mobile waste collection service, making house calls to gather human waste from private residences for disposal and resale. They were essentially running door-to-door pickup services for the most unpleasant commodity imaginable. The business model was surprisingly sophisticated for something involving literal shit collection. Night soil men operated on scheduled routes, maintaining regular customer relationships with households that generated sufficient waste to justify professional removal services. They were the medieval equivalent of garbage collectors, except their cargo was exponentially more horrifying, and their customer base was paying for the privilege of having someone take their excrement away. The technical challenges were numerous and creative. Unlike gong farmers who worked in fixed locations, night soil men had to transport waste through city streets without creating public health disasters or triggering community riots. They developed specialized containers, transport methods, and collection techniques that minimized spillage while maximizing capacity. It was logistics and engineering applied to the movement of human waste through populated areas. But here's where medieval economics gets fascinatingly disgusting. Night soil was valuable fertilizer, making waste collection a profitable enterprise rather than just a public service. Night soil men weren't just disposing of waste. They were harvesting agricultural resources that farmers paid premium prices for. They were running circular economy operations that converted urban waste into rural profit, creating sustainable business models based on human digestive output. The scheduling was crucial for both practical and social reasons. Night soil men worked primarily during nighttime hours to minimize public exposure and reduce the social embarrassment of their clients. They had to coordinate collection schedules with household routines, while managing their own transportation logistics to cover multiple customers per night. It was route optimization applied to waste collection in an era before GPS or even reliable street lighting. The client relationships required delicate diplomacy. Night soil men had to maintain professional relationships with customers who were paying them to handle the most intimate and embarrassing aspects of human biology. They needed to be discreet, reliable, and professional while dealing with products that nobody wanted to acknowledge producing. It was customer service in its most challenging form. What made this profession particularly demanding was the storage and processing requirements. Night soil men couldn't just collect waste and dump it randomly. They had to maintain inventory until they could transport it to agricultural customers or processing facilities. This required specialized storage areas, preservation techniques, and quality control measures that kept their product viable for agricultural use. The transportation technology was necessarily creative. Night soil men developed various cart designs, container systems, and transport methods that allowed them to move large quantities of waste through city streets without creating public health emergencies. They were essentially running mobile sewage processing operations using medieval technology and unlimited determination. The health risks were comprehensive and terrifying. Beyond the obvious disease transmission possibilities, night soil men faced chronic exposure to toxic gases, bacterial infections, and parasitic infestations that came with handling human waste on industrial scales. They were working in biological hazard zones without protective equipment, using their own immune systems as the primary defense against occupational health risks. But perhaps the most challenging aspect was managing the agricultural marketing side of the business. Night soil men had to maintain relationships with farmers who purchased their products, ensuring quality standards that met agricultural requirements while managing seasonal demand fluctuations that affected pricing. They were running agricultural supply operations specializing in human waste products. The social isolation was predictable, but severe. Night soil men were essential but untouchable, necessary but avoided. Creating professional relationships that were purely transactional, they couldn't participate in normal social activities, maintain regular friendships, or integrate into community life in ways that people whose jobs didn't involve handling human excrement took for granted. Some night soil men specialized in particular customer segments or developed innovative collection techniques that improved efficiency or reduced health risks. They might focus on wealthy households that generated higher quality waste, develop specialized equipment that improved collection speed, or create processing methods that enhanced the agricultural value of their products. The economic model required careful balance between collection costs and resale profits. Night soil men had to maintain equipment, manage transportation, cover storage expenses, and compensate themselves for health risks while keeping prices competitive with other fertilizer options. They were running complex businesses with multiple cost centers and revenue streams. What's particularly fascinating is how night soil men dealt with quality control issues. Not all human waste was equally valuable for agricultural purposes, and customers expected consistent quality from their fertilizer purchases. This required night soil men to develop expertise in waste evaluation, processing techniques, and quality enhancement methods that maximized the agricultural value of their products. The seasonal variations created business challenges that required strategic planning. Agricultural demand for fertilizer was concentrated during planting seasons. While waste production was constant throughout the year, night soil men had to manage inventory accumulation during low-demand periods while meeting surge requirements during peak agricultural seasons. The competition was intense in areas with multiple night soil men, creating territorial disputes and price wars that affected profit margins. Successful operators had to differentiate their services through reliability, quality, or specialized offerings that justified premium pricing in competitive markets. Some night soil men achieved regional recognition for exceptional service quality or innovative business practices. They built reputations based on reliability, discretion, and product quality that allowed them to command higher prices and maintain loyal customer bases in competitive markets. The career longevity was limited by health considerations and social factors. Few night soil men could maintain their health through extended careers involving constant waste exposure, and the social isolation often led to early retirement or career changes when alternative opportunities became available. These weren't just waste collectors. They were essential components of medieval urban infrastructure, providing sanitation services that prevented disease outbreaks while creating agricultural resources that supported food production. They managed the intersection between urban waste production and rural agricultural needs. They collected humanity's output so civilization could continue input. Before alarm clocks, smartphones, or any reliable timekeeping devices, medieval society faced a fundamental problem. How do you wake people up at specific times when most can't afford timepieces and roosters are notoriously unreliable? Enter the knocker-upper, whose job involved walking through towns before dawn, tapping on windows and doors with long sticks to wake paying customers. There were human alarm clocks, with route optimization challenges and weather-related occupational hazards. The technical requirements were more complex than simply wandering around making noise. Knocker-uppers needed to maintain accurate internal chronometers, remember dozens of customer addresses and wake-up times, and develop knocking techniques that roused intended targets without disturbing neighbors who hadn't paid for the service. They were running personalized time management services using nothing but memory, wooden sticks, and a supernatural ability to wake up before everyone else. But here's where medieval time management gets fascinatingly primitive. Knocker-uppers had no reliable way to determine accurate time themselves. They relied on church bells, celestial observations, candle clocks or water timers to establish baseline timing, then used internal biological clocks to maintain schedule accuracy throughout their routes. They were essentially human chronometers, calibrating themselves against medieval time-telling technology that was barely more accurate than educated guessing. The business model required extraordinary organization skills. Successful knocker-uppers maintained detailed mental databases of customer information, addresses, preferred wake-up times, payment schedules, special instructions, and seasonal variations in timing requirements. They were running customer relationship management systems entirely in their heads, while navigating dark streets and managing multiple time-sensitive appointments. The route optimization was crucial for efficiency and profitability. Knocker-uppers had to plan paths that minimized travel time between customers while maintaining precise timing for each wake-up call. They needed to account for seasonal changes in sunrise times, weather conditions that affected travel speed, and customer schedule variations that required flexible routing. It was logistics planning conducted entirely through mental calculation and practical experience. What made this job particularly challenging was the weather dependency. Knocker-uppers worked in all conditions: rain, snow, fog, storms, because their customers depended on reliable wake-up services regardless of atmospheric conditions. They developed specialized equipment for different weather scenarios and learned to navigate familiar routes in complete darkness or limited visibility conditions. The customer service aspect required delicate balance between effectiveness and diplomacy. Knocker-uppers needed to wake customers reliably without antagonizing neighbors, family members, or local authorities who might object to pre-dawn noise-making. They developed various techniques for targeted awakening, specific knocking patterns, voice calls, window tapping methods that maximized customer response while minimizing community disruption. The social dynamics were uniquely complex. Knocker-uppers interacted with customers during their most vulnerable moments, half asleep, disheveled, often grumpy about being awakened. They had to maintain professional relationships with people who were paying them to perform services that were inherently annoying, creating customer interactions that required exceptional interpersonal skills and psychological resilience. But perhaps the most impressive aspect was the memory requirements. Without written schedules or record-keeping systems, knocker-uppers had to memorize dozens of customer addresses, wake-up times, payment schedules, and special instructions. They were walking databases of personalized alarm information, maintaining accuracy levels that would challenge modern scheduling software. The health challenges were significant, but often overlooked. Knocker-uppers worked in darkness during the coldest parts of the day, walked extensive distances daily, and maintained schedules that required them to wake up hours before anyone else. They faced chronic sleep deprivation, weather exposure, and physical fatigue that would challenge modern fitness enthusiasts with proper nutrition and healthcare. Some knocker-uppers developed innovative techniques that improved efficiency or customer satisfaction. They might use different tools for different types of buildings, develop signature knocking patterns that customers could recognize, or create specialized equipment for reaching upper-story windows. These innovations could provide competitive advantages in markets with multiple service providers. The payment collection was challenging because it involved interacting with customers who were often barely conscious and not necessarily pleased about being awakened. Knocker-uppers had to maintain accurate mental accounting of payment schedules while conducting business transactions with people who were half asleep and potentially grumpy about the entire arrangement. What's particularly fascinating is how knocker-uppers calibrated their own wake-up times. They needed to be awake and alert before their earliest customers, but had no reliable alarm systems themselves. Some used multiple backup methods, candle clocks, water timers, or arrangements with other early risers to ensure they never overslept and failed their customers. The seasonal variations created scheduling complexities that required constant adjustment. Sunrise times changed throughout the year, affecting when customers needed to wake up for work, while seasonal weather patterns influenced route planning and travel times. Knocker-uppers had to maintain flexible scheduling systems that adapted to changing environmental conditions. The competition in areas with multiple knocker-uppers led to service differentiation and quality improvements. Successful operators might offer additional services like weather reports, time announcements, or message delivery to justify premium pricing or maintain customer loyalty in competitive markets. The career progression was limited, but possible. Experienced knocker-uppers might expand their operations to cover larger territories, hire assistants to handle route segments, or diversify into related services like message delivery or time-telling services. Some became local timekeeping authorities whose accuracy was trusted by entire communities. What's particularly impressive is the reliability standards that knocker-uppers maintained. Customers depended on them for essential wake-up services that affected work schedules, religious obligations, and other time-sensitive commitments. Knocker-uppers had to maintain near-perfect accuracy and reliability standards using primitive technology and their own biological systems. The social isolation was inevitable, but manageable. Knocker-uppers worked while everyone else was sleeping, creating schedules that limited normal social interaction, but also reducing competition for leisure time activities. They often formed professional communities with others who worked unusual hours. These weren't just early risers, they were essential infrastructure for medieval time management, providing personalized scheduling services that enabled other people to maintain regular work schedules in an era before reliable timekeeping technology. They woke up the world so civilization could get to work on time. Meet the petardier, medieval warfare's answer to the question who wants to plant explosives on enemy fortifications while people are shooting arrows at them. These specialized military engineers handled petards, early explosive devices used to breach castle gates and fortress walls, making them essentially medieval bomb disposal experts, except they were placing bombs instead of defusing them, and the bombs were primitive, unpredictable, and often as dangerous to the user as to the target. The technical requirements were sophisticated for someone working with gunpowder technology that was barely more advanced than firecrackers. Petardiers needed to understand explosive chemistry, structural engineering and military tactics while working with materials that could explode prematurely, fail to detonate when needed, or produce effects that were completely unpredictable. They were essentially running experimental ordnance operations in active combat zones. The petard itself was a bell-shaped explosive device, filled with gunpowder, and designed to be attached to enemy gates or walls. The phrase "hoist by his own petard" comes from the occupational hazard of petardiers being killed by their own explosives when something went wrong during placement or detonation. It was like being a demolitions expert whose equipment had the reliability of a medieval weather forecast and the safety features of a sharp stick. But here's where medieval military engineering gets fascinatingly dangerous. Petardiers had to approach enemy fortifications under active fire to place their explosives. They were running suicide missions with experimental technology, carrying volatile explosives through combat zones while being shot at by defenders who really didn't want their walls blown up. It was like being a pizza delivery driver, except the pizza was a bomb, and the customers were actively trying to kill you. The placement process required extraordinary courage and technical precision. Petardiers had to reach enemy gates or walls without being killed, attach their explosives in optimal positions for maximum structural damage, set up detonation systems that would work reliably, and escape before the explosion without being caught in the blast or shot by defenders. It was precision engineering conducted under the worst possible working conditions. The explosive technology was primitive and unreliable in ways that would terrify modern ordnance specialists. Gunpowder quality was inconsistent, fuse timing was unpredictable, and weather conditions could affect explosive performance in ways that nobody fully understood. Petardiers were working with ordnance that might explode too early, too late, too powerfully, or not at all, making every mission a creative combination of military tactics and explosive gambling. What made this profession particularly nerve-wracking was the friendly fire potential. Medieval armies weren't known for their coordination or communication skills, and petardiers often worked in situations where their own forces might mistake them for enemies or fail to coordinate attacks properly. They faced threats from enemy defenders, their own explosive devices, and occasionally their own army's confusion about what was happening. The training process was presumably the most dangerous apprenticeship in medieval military history. New petardiers had to learn explosive handling, military tactics, stealth techniques, and structural engineering through hands-on experience with materials that could kill them instantly if handled improperly. It was on-the-job training where mistakes had immediate and catastrophic consequences. The mission planning required expertise in multiple disciplines. Petardiers needed to study, target fortifications, plan approach routes, time attacks for optimal conditions, coordinate with supporting forces, and develop contingency plans for various failure scenarios. They were running complex military operations that combined engineering, tactics, and explosives handling in active combat situations. But perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect was the success metrics. A petardier's effectiveness was measured by their ability to destroy fortifications. But successful missions often involved significant casualties among both enemies and allies. They were creating massive explosions in populated areas, making it difficult to celebrate professional success when it involved considerable human destruction. The equipment maintenance was critical and dangerous. Petardiers had to prepare explosive charges, maintain fusing systems, transport volatile materials, and store gunpowder safely while moving through military campaigns. They were essentially running mobile munitions operations, using technology that modern safety regulations would classify as absolutely not acceptable under any circumstances. The career longevity was predictably short. Most petardiers either died in combat, were killed by their own explosives, or sustained injuries that ended their military service. Those who survived multiple campaigns became legendary figures, whose expertise was valuable, but whose life expectancy remained questionable, even with experience. What's particularly impressive is how petardiers dealt with the psychological pressure of working with explosives in combat. They had to maintain technical precision while under fire, make critical decisions about explosive placement while being shot at, and execute complex procedures while knowing that mistakes would result in immediate death. It required extraordinary mental discipline and stress tolerance. The tactical integration was complex, because petardier operations had to be coordinated with broader military strategies. Successful explosive attacks required supporting forces to exploit breaches, proper timing to maximize strategic impact, and coordination with other siege equipment and tactics. Petardiers were crucial components of larger military operations that depended on their success. Some petardiers developed innovations in explosive technology or tactics that improved effectiveness or survival rates. They might experiment with different gunpowder compositions, develop new attachment methods, or create timing systems that improved detonation reliability. These innovations could provide significant advantages in siege warfare. The social status was respectable, but precarious. Successful petardiers were valued military specialists whose expertise could determine the outcomes of sieges, but their association with explosives and high casualty rates made them both respected and feared by their own forces. They were essential, but dangerous allies whose presence reminded everyone of war's destructive potential. What makes petardiers particularly fascinating is how they balance technical precision with combat effectiveness. They needed to be skilled engineers capable of complex calculations and careful planning, but they also had to function as combat soldiers capable of operating under fire in extremely dangerous conditions. These weren't just soldiers, they were specialized military engineers who combined explosive technology with tactical expertise to breach fortifications that would otherwise be impregnable. They made medieval siege warfare possible through their willingness to carry bombs into active combat zones. They brought walls down so armies could march through. Enter the Resurrection Man, whose job involved procuring fresh cadavers for medical education and anatomical research through methods that were legally questionable, morally ambiguous, and professionally essential. These weren't just grave robbers, they were specialized procurement specialists, operating in the gray area between medical necessity and criminal enterprise, providing essential supplies for medieval medical training through techniques that modern medical schools prefer not to discuss in their promotional materials. The business demand was driven by medical education requirements that conflicted with religious and legal restrictions on an anatomical dissection. Medical schools needed fresh corpses for teaching anatomy, but religious authorities forbade dissection of consecrated bodies, and legal systems provided limited access to executed criminals. This created a supply shortage that Resurrection Men filled through creative interpretation of property laws and nocturnal entrepreneurship. The technical skills required were surprisingly sophisticated. Resurrection Men needed expertise in grave location and assessment, rapid excavation techniques, body preservation methods, and covert transportation systems. They were essentially running specialized logistics operations that required knowledge of cemetery layouts, soil conditions, burial practices, and law enforcement patrol schedules. It was archaeological excavation conducted under extreme time pressure, with significant legal risks. But here's where medieval medical education gets fascinatingly macabre. Resurrection Men weren't just stealing bodies randomly. They were providing quality-controlled cadavers that met specific medical education requirements. Fresh bodies were preferred over decomposed ones. Certain demographic characteristics were more valuable for particular types of instruction, and seasonal timing affected both supply availability and preservation requirements. The excavation process was carefully choreographed to minimize detection while maximizing efficiency. Resurrection Men developed specialized tools for rapid digging, techniques for opening graves without disturbing surface markers, and methods for removing bodies while leaving graves appearing undisturbed. They were essentially conducting reverse burials, extracting corpses as efficiently as grave diggers buried them. The preservation and transportation challenges were complex because medical schools required bodies in usable condition for anatomical instruction. Resurrection Men had to maintain cold storage, prevent decomposition during transport, and deliver products that met quality standards for medical education. They were running refrigerated supply chains using medieval technology and unlimited creativity. What made this profession particularly risky was the legal status, which varied between probably illegal and definitely illegal, depending on local jurisdictions and enforcement attitudes. Resurrection Men operated in legal gray areas where body theft was criminal, but medical education was essential, creating situations where authorities often looked the other way, while maintaining official disapproval of the practices that made medical training possible. The client relationships were professionally delicate, because medical schools needed Resurrection Man services, but couldn't officially acknowledge using illegally obtained cadavers. This created business arrangements that were conducted through intermediaries, coded communications, and payment systems that maintained plausible deniability for both suppliers and customers. It was business-to-business commerce conducted like drug deals. The seasonal variations affected both supply and demand in ways that created complex business planning requirements. Winter weather made excavation more difficult, but improved body preservation, while summer conditions facilitated digging, but accelerated decomposition. Medical school academic calendars created predictable demand patterns that Resurrection Men had to anticipate and prepare for. But perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect was the social stigma and moral implications of the work. Resurrection Men were providing essential services for medical education, but their methods violated religious beliefs about proper treatment of the dead and family expectations about burial sanctity. They were doing socially valuable work through socially unacceptable means. The competition was intense in areas with multiple medical schools or active Resurrection Men, leading to territorial disputes over prime cemetery locations and conflicts over customer relationships. Successful operators had to balance competitive pricing against operational risks, while maintaining service quality in markets with limited and time-sensitive inventory. Some Resurrection Men specialized in particular types of procurement or developed innovations that improved efficiency or reduced legal risks. They might focus on CISIC cemeteries, develop relationships with cemetery workers who could provide inside information, or create transportation methods that reduce detection possibilities. These specializations could provide competitive advantages in challenging markets. The security measures were essential. because resurrection men faced threats from law enforcement, cemetery security, grieving families, and competitors. They needed to develop surveillance detection techniques, establish secure storage facilities, maintain covert Kevergum methods, and create escape plans for various emergency scenarios. What's particularly fascinating is how resurrection men dealt with the ethical implications of their work. Many rationalized their activities through the medical benefits of anatomical education, arguing that their illegal procurement enabled medical advances that saved lives. They were balancing immediate moral violations against long-term medical benefits in ways that created complex ethical frameworks. The business model required careful balance between procurement costs and resale profits, while managing significant legal and physical risks. Resurrection men had to invest in specialized equipment, maintain secure facilities, compensate themselves for legal risks, and price their services competitively against alternative cadaver sources when available. The career progression was limited by legal risks and social stigma, but successful resurrection men could build substantial operations with multiple procurement specialists and established customer relationships. Some transitioned into legitimate medical supply businesses when legal access to cadavers became available through regulatory changes. The professional networks were necessarily covert, but surprisingly extensive. Resurrection men often maintained relationships with cemetery workers, medical school contacts, transportation specialists, and other resurrection men in different regions. These networks enabled information sharing, resource coordination, and mutual support in a profession that required extensive cooperation despite legal risks. What makes resurrection men particularly notable is their contribution to medical education during periods when legal access to cadavers was severely restricted. They enabled anatomical instruction that advanced medical knowledge and improved healthcare outcomes through methods that were illegal but arguably essential for medical progress. The social impact was significant because resurrection men's procurement activities enabled medical education that wouldn't have been possible through legal means alone. They were essential components of medical training systems that depended on anatomical instruction using real human bodies for educational effectiveness. These weren't just criminals. They were specialized procurement professionals who enabled medical education through illegal but essential supply chain management. They provided medical schools with educational materials that advanced medical knowledge, despite operating outside legal frameworks. They dug up the dead so medical students could learn to heal the living. Meet the whipping boy, whose job description was unique in the annals of employment history. Receive physical punishment for someone else's mistakes, misbehavior, and general character flaws. This wasn't metaphorical scapegoating. This was literal, contractual responsibility for absorbing beatings that were intended for princes and noble children who were considered too valuable to discipline directly. It was outsourced punishment services for medieval elite families who wanted to maintain discipline without damaging their own offspring. The position requirements were refreshingly straightforward. Be approximately the same age as your assigned prince, possess sufficient physical resilience to survive regular beatings, and maintain the psychological stability necessary to form friendships with someone whose mistakes would result in your physical punishment. It was like being a professional best friend, except your friend's bad behavior had immediate and painful consequences for your personal well-being. But here's where medieval child-rearing gets fascinatingly twisted. Whipping boys weren't randomly selected peasant children. They were carefully chosen companions who shared education, living quarters, and daily activities with their assigned princes. They developed genuine friendships while knowing that their friends' misbehavior would result in their own suffering. It was friendship with built-in conflict of interest that would challenge modern relationship counselors. The educational component was comprehensive, because whipping boys needed to share their prince's learning experiences to understand the context of potential punishments. They received the same tutoring in languages, mathematics, military tactics, and courtly behavior, making them among the best educated commoners of their time. They were getting premium educations as compensation for serving as human punishment proxies. The psychological dynamics were extraordinarily complex. Whipping boys had to maintain loyalty and friendship with princes who were directly responsible for their physical suffering, while princes had to form emotional bonds with companions whose pain was the consequence of their own actions. It created relationships that were simultaneously intimate and professionally traumatic. What made this job particularly challenging was the unpredictability factor. Whipping boys never knew when their prince's behavior might trigger punishment sessions, creating constant anxiety about potential beatings that could occur without warning. They lived in permanent anticipation of physical pain that was completely outside their control but entirely their responsibility to endure. The punishment protocols were carefully structured to maximize educational impact, while maintaining the whipping boy's long-term viability. Beatings had to be severe enough to motivate princely behavior modification, but not so extreme that they permanently damaged or killed the whipping boy. It was calibrated violence designed to create psychological impact through proxy suffering. The social status was uniquely contradictory. Whipping boys were servants whose job involved being beaten, but they also served as companions to future rulers and received educational opportunities that elevated their social positions. They existed in hierarchical limbo, too valuable to be ordinary servants, too expendable to be treated as equals, too educated to be ignored, too punished to be respected. But perhaps the most psychologically fascinating aspect was how whipping boys dealt with the emotional complexity of their relationships with their princes. They had to maintain genuine affection for people whose behavior directly caused their physical suffering, while developing coping mechanisms that preserved their mental health during regular punishment sessions. Some whipping boys developed sophisticated psychological strategies for managing their unique professional challenges. They might negotiate informal agreements with their princes about behavior standards, develop communication methods for influencing princely decision-making, or create mental frameworks that separated personal relationships from professional punishment responsibilities. The career advancement opportunities were limited, but potentially significant. Successful whipping boys who maintained good relationships with their princes could receive preferential treatment when their charges assumed power, potentially leading to court positions, administrative roles, or other opportunities that leveraged their intimate knowledge of royal personalities and preferences. The training process was presumably awkward for everyone involved. New whipping boys had to learn court etiquette, educational requirements, and pain tolerance techniques, while establishing personal relationships with the children whose mistakes would cause their suffering. It was professional development that combined academic instruction with conditioning for physical punishment. What's particularly disturbing is how whipping boys were expected to accept punishment gracefully. While maintaining positive relationships with their princes, they couldn't express anger, resentment, or blame toward the people whose behavior caused their beatings, requiring emotional regulation skills that would challenge modern therapy professionals. The physical health management was crucial because whipping boys needed to maintain their ability to endure regular beatings while preserving their long-term functionality as educational companions. They required medical care, physical conditioning, and recovery time management that balanced punishment effectiveness against professional sustainability. The social isolation was inevitable, because whipping boys couldn't form normal peer relationships with other children. Their unique professional circumstances created social barriers that prevented ordinary friendships, while their educational privileges separated them from servants and their punishment responsibilities distinguished them from nobles. Some whipping boys achieved historical recognition through their relationships with princes who became significant rulers. They were mentioned in court records, biographical accounts, and historical documents as important figures in royal education, despite their primary role being professional punishment recipients. The ethical implications were complex, because whipping boys were providing valuable services for royal education while enduring systematic physical abuse. They were essential components of medieval child-rearing practices, but balanced discipline requirements against politicals in ways that created morally ambiguous professional arrangements. What makes whipping boys particularly notable is their contribution to royal education during periods when direct punishment of royal children was politically impossible. They enabled disciplinary systems that shaped future rulers' character development through proxy punishment methods that preserved royal dignity while maintaining behavioral standards. The long-term outcomes for whipping boys varied significantly based on their relationships with their princes and their ability to leverage their unique positions for career advancement. Some achieved substantial success through royal patronage, while others suffered lasting physical and psychological damage from their professional punishment responsibilities. These weren't just victims, they were specialized educational support professionals who enabled royal child-rearing through personal sacrifice. They absorbed physical punishment to preserve royal dignity while contributing to leadership development that affected entire kingdoms. They took the hits so princes could learn to rule. Enter the herb strewer, whose job involved combating the overwhelming sensory assault of medieval life through strategic deployment of aromatic plants. These weren't just people randomly scattering herbs around. They were specialized atmospheric engineers who used botanical knowledge to make medieval environments bearable for human habitation. In a world where personal hygiene was optional and sewage management was primitive, herb strewers were the thin, fragrant line between civilization and complete olfactory surrender. The technical requirements were surprisingly sophisticated for someone whose job description amounted to make things smell less horrible. Herb strewers needed extensive botanical knowledge to identify plants with appropriate aromatic properties, understand seasonal availability of different herbs, and develop application techniques that maximized fragrance while minimizing waste. They were essentially running mobile aromatherapy operations using medieval technology and unlimited determination. But here's where medieval environmental management gets fascinatingly primitive. Herb strewers weren't just masking bad smells. They were implementing the medieval equivalent of air purification systems based on the theory that diseases were transmitted through bad air, or miasma. Their work was considered medical intervention as much as environmental improvement, making them public health specialists armed with lavender and rosemary. The workplace environments were exactly as challenging as you'd expect. Herb strewers worked in castles where hundreds of people lived without adequate sanitation, great halls where massive feasts generated enormous quantities of food waste, and ceremonial spaces where large crowds gathered without access to modern hygiene facilities. They were trying to create pleasant atmospheric conditions in spaces that violated every principle of modern environmental health. The plant procurement was seasonal and geographically dependent, creating supply chain challenges that required extensive planning and resource management. Herb strewers needed to harvest herbs during optimal seasons, develop preservation techniques for long-term storage, and maintain inventory systems that ensured adequate supplies during periods when fresh herbs were unavailable. What made this profession particularly demanding was the real-time application requirements. Herb strewers had to respond immediately to environmental crises, unexpected odor outbreaks, crowd-related atmospheric problems, or ceremonial events that required enhanced aromatic conditions. They were running emergency response operations for olfactory disasters, using nothing but dried plants and professional expertise. The client relationships were complex because herb strewers worked for people who lived in environments that were fundamentally incompatible with pleasant smells. They had to manage expectations about what botanical interventions could accomplish while working in spaces where basic sanitation was absent and personal hygiene was viewed as unnecessary luxury. The application techniques were surprisingly varied and sophisticated. Herb strewers developed different deployment methods for different environments. Floor strewing for general coverage, concentrated applications for specific problem areas, hanging arrangements for sustained release, and portable herb bundles for personal use. They were creating customized aromatic solutions for various medieval environmental challenges. But perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect was the futility factor. No matter how many herbs they scattered, medieval environments remained fundamentally unpleasant due to systemic sanitation problems that botanical interventions couldn't solve. Herb strewers were applying band-aids to problems that required major infrastructure improvements that wouldn't exist for several centuries. The seasonal variations affected both herb availability and working conditions in ways that created complex planning requirements. Summer provided abundant fresh herbs, but also generated peak odor problems due to heat and increased bacterial activity. Winter limited plant availability, but reduced some environmental challenges, while creating others related to indoor crowding and poor ventilation. Some herb strewers specialized in particular environments or developed innovations that improved effectiveness or efficiency. They might focus on ceremonial events that required premium aromatic conditions, develop new herb combinations that provided enhanced fragrance, or create preservation techniques that extended the useful life of their botanical inventory. The quality control was essential, because ineffective herb strewing could leave clients exposed to environmental conditions that were genuinely unpleasant and potentially unhealthy. Herb strewers had to maintain standards that provided real atmospheric improvement, while managing resource constraints that limited their ability to completely transform medieval environmental realities. What's particularly impressive is how herb strewers developed expertise in plant properties that modern aromatherapy specialists would recognize as scientifically valid. Many of the herbs they used actually do have antimicrobial properties, insect-repelling characteristics, or mood-enhancing effects that provided genuine benefits beyond simple fragrance masking. The business model required balance between material costs and service pricing, while managing the seasonal availability that affected both supply costs and demand patterns. Herb strewers had to invest in plant procurement, storage facilities, and application equipment, while pricing their services competitively in markets where aromatic improvement was often viewed as luxury rather than necessity. The health benefits were probably more significant than medieval people realized. Many herbs used by herb strewers had natural antimicrobial properties that actually did help prevent disease transmission, insect-repelling characteristics that reduced pest problems, and psychological effects that improved mood and stress levels in challenging living conditions. The social status was respectable, but specialized, creating career opportunities for people with botanical knowledge and attention to environmental details. Successful herb strewers could build substantial client bases among wealthy families who valued aromatic comfort and ceremonial organizers who needed environmental enhancement for special events. What makes herb strewers particularly fascinating is their role in making medieval life tolerable for people who had no other options for environmental improvement. They provided real quality of life enhancements in situations where basic sanitation infrastructure didn't exist and wouldn't be developed for generations. The cultural impact was significant because herb strewers' work enabled social activities, ceremonial events, and daily living arrangements that would have been unbearable without aromatic intervention. They made medieval social life possible by creating environmental conditions that allowed people to gather in large groups without complete sensory overwhelm. The professional knowledge was extensive and included botanical identification, preservation techniques, application methods, and customer service skills that enabled herb strewers to provide effective environmental improvement services in challenging medieval conditions. These weren't just people scattering plants around. They were environmental management specialists who used botanical expertise to create livable conditions in a world where basic sanitation infrastructure hadn't been invented yet. They made medieval life bearable through strategic deployment of aromatic plants. They fought the olfactory war so civilization could breathe easier. And now we arrive at perhaps the most prestigious of all medieval bathroom-related careers, the groom of the stool, whose job involved managing the toilet habits of royalty with the kind of attention to detail that modern personal assistants would find excessive. This wasn't just about cleaning up after kings. This was comprehensive bathroom management for people whose digestive processes were considered matters of state security and whose bowel movements required professional documentation. The position title sounds quaint until you realize that stool referred to both the portable toilet chair used by royalty and the actual contents of said chair, making the groom of the stool responsible for both the furniture and its biological output. They were essentially running personal waste management operations for people whose bathroom habits were too important to be left to amateur supervision. But here's where medieval royal service gets fascinatingly intimate. The groom of the stool was often one of the most trusted and influential people in the royal court. They had unlimited private access to the monarch, knew details about royal health that could affect his succession decisions, and possessed information about royal vulnerability that made them both valuable allies and dangerous security risks. It was bathroom attendant work that came with significant political influence. The technical responsibilities were comprehensive and surprisingly complex. Grooms of the stool managed toilet scheduling, maintained portable toilet equipment, monitored royal digestive health, documented bathroom habits for medical purposes, and provided personal assistance during toilet activities. They were running full-service bathroom operations that combined medical monitoring with equipment maintenance and personal care services. The medical surveillance aspect was crucial, because royal digestive health was considered a matter of national importance. Changes in royal bowel movements could indicate poison attempts, developing illnesses, or other health problems that might affect political stability. Grooms of the stool were essentially conducting daily medical diagnostics through careful examination of royal waste products. What made this job particularly demanding was the privacy and security requirements. Royal bathroom activities were state secrets that required absolute discretion, while the intimate nature of the work created security vulnerabilities that needed careful management. Grooms of the stool had to maintain professional confidentiality while possessing information that could be politically or personally damaging if disclosed. The equipment management was surprisingly sophisticated for medieval bathroom technology. Royal toilet chairs were elaborate pieces of furniture that required regular cleaning, maintenance, and transport during royal travel. Grooms of the stool maintained specialized cleaning supplies, portable toilet equipment, and privacy arrangements that enabled royal bathroom activities in various locations and circumstances. The client relationship was uniquely intimate and professionally challenging. Grooms of the stool had to maintain dignified service relationships while providing assistance with the most private and undignified aspects of human biology. They needed exceptional interpersonal skills to preserve royal dignity while managing situations that were inherently embarrassing and vulnerable. But perhaps the most psychologically complex aspect was the social status contradiction. Grooms of the stool were highly trusted royal servants with significant court influence, but their primary job involved handling human waste. They occupied positions of privilege based on their willingness to provide services that most people would find completely unacceptable. The training process was presumably conducted through apprenticeship with experienced grooms of the stool, though the specific curriculum for royal bathroom management isn't well documented in historical records. New grooms had to learn medical observation techniques, equipment maintenance, diplomatic skills, and the psychological resilience necessary for intimate service relationships. The career advancement opportunities were substantial for people who successfully managed royal bathroom responsibilities. Many grooms of the stool received additional court appointments, administrative responsibilities, and political influence that leveraged their trusted relationships with monarchs. They could transition into broader royal service roles that utilized their intimate knowledge of royal personalities and preferences. What's particularly impressive is how grooms of the stool balanced medical responsibilities with personal service requirements while maintaining the diplomatic skills necessary for court politics. They were simultaneously healthcare providers, equipment specialists, personal assistants, and trusted confidants, whose professional success depended on excelling in all these areas. The security implications were significant because grooms of the stool had private access to royalty during vulnerable moments, and possessed detailed knowledge about royal health and habits. They were potential assassination facilitators, or intelligence sources whose loyalty was essential for royal security, making their selection and management crucial for political stability. The documentation requirements were extensive because royal digestive patterns were monitored for medical and security purposes. Grooms of the stool maintained detailed records about royal bathroom habits, health observations, and any unusual patterns that might indicate problems requiring medical attention or security investigation. Some grooms of the stool achieved historical significance through their relationships with important monarchs or their roles in political events that occurred during their service. They appear in court records, biographical accounts, and historical documents as influential figures whose bathroom management responsibilities provided access to significant political power. The social dynamics were complex because grooms of the stool interacted with other court officials while managing responsibilities that were both essential and embarrassing. They had to maintain professional relationships with people who knew exactly what their job involved, creating social situations that required exceptional diplomatic skills and psychological resilience. What makes grooms of the stool particularly fascinating is their demonstration that even the most undignified jobs could become positions of significant influence and respect when performed at the highest levels of society. They transformed bathroom attendants into political opportunity through professional excellence and personal discretion. The long-term career outcomes for grooms of the stool varied based on their relationships with their royal employers and their ability to leverage their trusted positions for advancement opportunities. Many achieved substantial success through royal patronage and court influence that extended far beyond their original bathroom management responsibilities. The cultural impact was significant because grooms of the stool enabled royal mobility and public appearances by providing reliable bathroom management services that allowed monarchs to maintain dignity while addressing basic biological needs in various circumstances and locations. These weren't just bathroom attendants. They were trusted royal advisors whose intimate service responsibilities provided access to political influence and court power. They managed the most private aspects of royal life while building careers that extended far beyond waste management. They handled royal business so kingdoms could conduct their business. Meet the fuller, whose job combined the worst aspects of laundry service with chemical warfare, creating what might have been medieval society's most comprehensively unpleasant profession. These textile specialists were responsible for cleaning, thickening, and preparing cloth using processes that involved human urine, animal feces, and various toxic substances that would violate every workplace safety regulation ever written if applied to modern employment law. The technical process of fulling was sophisticated chemistry disguised as laundry service. Fullers used fermented urine as a cleaning agent because the ammonia content removed oils and dirt from wool fibers, while also helping to set dyes and improve fabric texture. They were essentially running industrial chemical processing operations, using human and animal waste products as primary reagents, creating textile improvements through controlled biological decomposition. But here's where medieval textile manufacturing gets fascinatingly disgusting. The urine collection was a community effort that required fullers to maintain relationships with local residents who provided regular urine supplies. Fullers operated collection systems that gathered human waste from entire neighborhoods, creating supply chain management challenges that modern logistics specialists would find both impressive and horrifying. The cloth preparation process involved soaking textiles in vats of fermented urine for extended periods, then trampling them underfoot to work the cleaning agents through the fabric fibers. Fullers spent their working days standing in containers of fermenting urine, stomping on cloth while being splashed with ammonia-rich waste hacks that created chemical burns and respiratory problems. The workspace environments were exactly as pleasant as you'd expect from facilities that specialized in fermenting human waste for textile processing. Fuller workshops were filled with vats of decomposing urine, piles of wet cloth that had been soaked in waste products, and atmospheric conditions that would challenge modern hazmat specialists. They were working in chemical processing plants disguised as laundry facilities. What made this profession particularly challenging was the seasonal variations that affected both urine quality and processing conditions. Winter urine was considered superior because cold weather produced more concentrated waste products, while summer conditions accelerated fermentation but created storage problems. Fullers had to manage inventory systems for human waste that required expertise in biological chemistry and seasonal planning. The chemical hazards were comprehensive and creative. Beyond the obvious risks from prolonged exposure to fermenting urine, fullers worked with various toxic cleaning agents, caustic dyes, and processing chemicals that created occupational health problems, including skin burns, respiratory damage, and chronic poisoning from heavy metals used in textile treatments. The client relationships were professionally awkward because fullers provided essential textile services while working with materials that clients preferred not to think about. They had to maintain business relationships with people who needed their services but didn't want to acknowledge the specific methods used to achieve textile cleaning and improvement results. But perhaps the most psychologically demanding aspect was the social stigma associated with working in human waste processing. Fullers were essential textile specialists whose work enabled the clothing industry, but their association with urine collection and processing created social isolation that affected their ability to participate in normal community activities. The quality control requirements were surprisingly sophisticated because different types of cloth required specific processing techniques and chemical treatments. Fullers needed expertise in textile identification, chemical concentration management, and processing timing that ensured optimal results without damaging expensive fabrics or failing to meet customer quality expectations. Some fullers specialized in particular types of textiles or developed innovations that improved processing efficiency or reduced health hazards. They might focus on luxury fabrics that required premium processing techniques, develop new chemical combinations that enhanced cleaning effectiveness, or create equipment improvements that reduced direct exposure to toxic materials. The business model required balance between material costs and service pricing. While managing health risks that affected long-term career sustainability, fullers had to invest in processing equipment, maintain urine inventory, cover healthcare costs related to occupational hazards, and price their services competitively in markets with significant demand for textile processing. What's particularly impressive is how fullers developed expertise in textile chemistry that modern fabric specialists would recognize as scientifically valid. Many of their processing techniques actually did improve fabric quality, durability, and appearance through chemical treatments that enhanced textile properties in ways that weren't fully understood until modern chemistry explained the underlying mechanisms. The environmental impact was significant because fuller operations created pollution problems that affected entire communities. Processing facilities generated toxic waste, atmospheric contamination, and water pollution that created public health challenges requiring careful facility location and waste management that balanced industrial needs against community safety. The seasonal workflow created business planning challenges because textile processing demand varied throughout the year, while urine supply remained relatively constant. Fullers had to manage inventory accumulation during low-demand periods, while meeting surge requirements during peak textile processing seasons that tested their storage and processing capacity. The career progression was possible, but limited by health considerations and social factors. Successful fullers could expand their operations to handle larger volumes or more specialized processing. But the occupational health hazards often forced early retirement or career changes when alternative opportunities became available. What makes fullers particularly notable is their essential role in medieval textile production during periods when synthetic cleaning agents didn't exist, and fabric processing required biological and chemical techniques that utilized available waste products. They enabled clothing manufacturing that supported entire communities through their willingness to work with materials that modern people would consider unacceptable. The technological impact was significant because fuller innovations in textile processing contributed to fabric quality improvements that enhanced clothing durability, appearance, and functionality. They developed chemical processing techniques that remained standard in textile manufacturing until synthetic alternatives became available centuries later. The professional knowledge was extensive and included textile identification, chemical processing, quality control, and customer service skills that enabled fullers to provide effective fabric processing services despite working with materials and methods that created significant personal and environmental challenges. These weren't just laundry workers. They were chemical processing specialists who used waste products to create textile improvements that enabled medieval clothing production. They transformed human waste into textile enhancement through specialized knowledge and professional dedication. They soaked in urine so everyone else could wear clean clothes. So here we are, at the end of our journey through medieval employment's greatest hits, or perhaps more accurately, its greatest misses of what anyone would consider desirable career paths. We've met gong farmers who shoveled through humanity's digestive aftermath, executioners who made death their business, and sin-eaters who literally consumed other people's moral baggage. These weren't just jobs. They were testament to the human capacity for adaptation, survival, and the ability to find purpose in even the most soul-crushing circumstances imaginable. What strikes me most about these professions isn't just their obvious horror, though that's certainly impressive, but their absolute necessity. Every single one of these jobs, no matter how revolting or psychologically damaging, was essential for medieval society to function. The gong farmers prevented cities from drowning in their own waste. The executioners maintained law and order through ultimate deterrence. The sin-eaters provided psychological comfort that helped communities cope with death and religious anxiety. Think about that for a moment. These people weren't society's outcasts doing meaningless work. They were the essential infrastructure that kept civilization running. They were the human equivalent of sewage systems, criminal justice departments, and mental health services, except personalized and infinitely more traumatic for the individuals involved. The psychological resilience required for these careers is almost beyond modern comprehension. Imagine waking up every morning knowing your job involves descending into pits of human waste, or consuming the moral sins of dead strangers, or standing in vats of fermenting urine while trampling cloth. These people developed coping mechanisms and found meaning in work that would break most modern employees within hours. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect is how these professions created their own forms of dignity and professional pride. Executioners developed reputations for clean, skillful work. Gong farmers formed professional guilds with standards and territories. Herb strewers became botanical experts whose knowledge rivaled modern aromatherapy specialists. They transformed horrible jobs into skilled trades through expertise, professionalism, and sheer determination. The social dynamics were equally complex. Medieval society simultaneously depended on these workers and ostracized them, needed their services, and despised their associations with death, waste, and moral corruption. They were essential but untouchable, creating social hierarchies that were both cruel and practically necessary for community psychological health. What's particularly striking is how many of these jobs required sophisticated technical knowledge. Leech collectors needed to distinguish between species and maintain living inventory. Petardiers combined chemistry, engineering, and military tactics. Barber surgeons performed complex medical procedures using primitive tools. These weren't just desperate people doing desperate work. They were skilled professionals operating in impossible circumstances. The health risks were universally catastrophic, but people accepted them because the alternative was starvation or social exile. Medieval employment law was essentially work or die, with no safety regulations, workers' compensation, or alternative career options for people born into these professions. They traded their health, social status, and often their lives for basic survival in a world that offered few alternatives. But here's what I find most remarkable. Many of these people found genuine purpose in their work. Sin eaters saw themselves as spiritual martyrs saving souls. Executioners maintained law and order. Herb strewers made life more bearable for entire communities. They created meaning from meaninglessness, dignity from degradation, and professional pride from public shame. The innovation and adaptation these professions required is genuinely impressive. Workers constantly developed new techniques, tools and methods to improve efficiency, reduce health risks, or enhance service quality. They were running continuous improvement programs in industries that modern people wouldn't touch with hazmat suits and legal immunity. The social impact extended far beyond the individuals involved. These professions enabled medieval urban development, legal systems, medical education, and basic sanitation that supported population growth and technological advancement. Without people willing to do these jobs, medieval civilization would have collapsed under its own waste and dysfunction. What makes these professions particularly poignant is how they demonstrate human adaptability and the capacity to find meaning in any circumstances. These weren't just survival stories, they were examples of people creating professional identities, social relationships, and personal purpose within systems that were designed to dehumanize and isolate them. The economic implications were significant because many of these jobs were actually well compensated due to their difficulty and necessity. Executioners, tasters, and specialized fullers could earn substantial incomes, creating economic opportunities for people willing to accept social costs and health risks that others wouldn't tolerate. The technological contributions were often overlooked, but genuinely important. Medieval workers developed techniques and innovations that remained standard practice for centuries. Fuller processing methods, leach collection techniques, and waste management systems provided foundations for industries that evolved into modern equivalents with better safety standards and social acceptance. Looking back at these professions provides perspective on modern workplace complaints and employment challenges. Your difficult boss, long hours, or workplace stress pale in comparison to careers that involved regular exposure to plague, toxic chemicals, and social ostracism. These people dealt with employment challenges that make modern work problems seem almost luxurious by comparison. The legacy of these professions lives on in modern equivalents that have evolved to include safety regulations, professional respect, and social acceptance. Today's sanitation engineers, criminal justice professionals, and healthcare workers perform similar functions with dramatically improved working conditions and social status. But perhaps most importantly, these stories remind us that every society depends on people willing to do essential work that others won't touch. Behind every functioning civilization are individuals who handle the dangerous, disgusting, and psychologically demanding jobs that keep everything else running smoothly. So the next time you're having a rough day at work, remember Geoffrey the Gong Farmer, Agnes the Sin Eater, and all the others who built civilization one horrible shift at a time. They found purpose in the impossible and dignity in the degrading, proving that human resilience and professional dedication can transform even the worst jobs into essential services. They did the impossible so we could have the merely difficult. Sweet dreams, everyone. And remember, no matter how bad your Monday morning feels, at least you're not waking up to a career in medieval waste management. If you enjoyed this journey through history's worst employment opportunities, you know what to do. Because honestly, after everything we've been through together, a simple like and subscribe seems almost pleasant by comparison.